In the summer of 1970, as American involvement in the Vietnam War was beginning its slow decline, the U.S. Army found itself fighting one of the war's least known yet most vicious battles, the siege of Firebase Ripcord. Located deep in the rugged A Shau Valley, Ripcord was one of several remote mountain fire bases created to block North Vietnamese Army NVA supply routes feeding across the border from Laos. Strategically perched on Hill 927, the base commanded a wide view of the surrounding jungles, a vantage that both sides understood could decide control of the valley. Although many Americans back home believed the war was winding down, the soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division faced a very different reality. For them, Ripcord was a test of survival against an enemy determined to erase the fire base from the map. Unknown to the Americans digging into the red clay, thousands of NVA troops had already infiltrated the area, preparing for a massive, coordinated assault. When Ripcord was reopened in March 1970, after being abandoned earlier, the U.S. hoped to regain initiative during Operation Texas Star. Instead, they found themselves walking into a trap meticulously prepared by the NVA 324B Division. The soldiers initially thought they were reinforcing a routine observation outpost, but each patrol revealed disturbing clues: fresh NVA bunkers, hidden trails, and captured documents hinting that the firebase was surrounded. In the weeks leading up to the siege, helicopter crews noticed anti-aircraft fire increasing dramatically, forcing them to take evasive routes. Still, the airborne troops kept building defensive positions, hauling sandbags, and setting up artillery, unaware that the enemy, hidden behind layers of jungle, was tightening a ring around them with mathematical precision. By early July, the situation had transformed from uneasy quiet to explosive violence. The NVA began systematically targeting the helicopter resupply missions that Ripcord depended on for survival. Each Huey flight became a deadly gamble, with pilots threading their way through bursts of machine gun and mortar fire. Without helicopters, the firebase would suffocate. Everything, water, ammunition, medical supplies, came from the sky. On July 1st, the NVA unleashed one of the first major bombardments, hitting the exposed hilltop with mortars, recoilless rifles, and rockets. The Americans scrambled into bunkers as explosions tore through the communications tent and damaged several artillery pieces. Every day afterward, the shelling intensified. The NVA had constructed complex mortar pits and firing positions hidden in the brush, nearly impossible to spot from the air. Forward observers taking risks on nearby ridges tried calling counter-battery fire, but the enemy weapons were moved quickly through underground trenches. The base began to resemble a lunar landscape, craters swallowing bunkers, trees shredded into jagged stumps, and smoke rising constantly. Despite the chaos, the 101st Airborne fought with discipline and grit. Infantry companies patrolled aggressively around Ripcord, attempting to disrupt the siege, but they repeatedly ran into well-prepared NVA ambushes. Company B of the 2506th encountered devastating fire that left dozens of casualties. Medevac helicopters, despite being painted with red crosses, were shot at relentlessly. Pilots later recalled that Ripcord was the most dangerous landing they had ever attempted. One of the most harrowing events occurred when a CH-47 Chinook carrying heavy equipment was hit by ground fire and crashed near the perimeter, erupting in flames that lit the mountainside. Although the siege was tightening, the men of Ripcord continued to dig deeper, fight harder, and hold the hill, even as the enemy's strength grew daily. The period from July 12th to July 23rd marked the climax of the siege, when the NVA launched coordinated assaults aimed at finally overrunning the Firebase. They used a brutal combination of mortar barrages, followed by ground attacks, timing them to exploit moments when the Americans were forced out of cover. On several nights, hundreds of NVA soldiers rushed up the slopes under the cover of darkness, using grenades, satchel charges, and RPGs to break through defensive positions. The defenders of Ripcord, armed with M16 rifles, M79 grenade launchers, M60 machine guns, and claymore mines, fought with unwavering determination. Artillery crews kept firing even as their own pits were collapsing around them. One 105mm artillery piece was knocked out, but the crew dragged shells by hand to another gun so counterfire could continue. The NVA suffered heavy casualties in each assault, but for every unit repelled, replacements seemed to flow from the jungle like a relentless tide. The 101st Airborne called in massive air support, Cobra gunships, F-4 Phantom jets, and even B-52 arc-light strikes that shook the ground like earthquakes. Yet the enemy remained dug in. The terrain worked entirely in their favor. Every ridgeline concealed bunkers, reinforced by logs and clay. As the attacks mounted, it became clear that the Firebase could not be held indefinitely. Commanders on the ground radioed that ammunition was being expended faster than it could be resupplied. Water was running dangerously low. Several artillery tubes had overheated from constant firing. Helicopters were being destroyed or driven away by anti-aircraft fire. Casualties increased daily, and medical evacuation became almost impossible during daylight. Every surviving soldier remembered the overwhelming sense that the hill was dying. Yet, despite exhaustion, the airborne troops held firm, knowing that abandoning Ripcord would allow the NVA to dominate the valley. Still, the enemy pressure was intensifying, and the Americans were reaching the limits of what human endurance could sustain. By July 22nd, American leadership made the agonizing decision to withdraw. The goal had shifted from holding Ripcord to saving as many lives as possible. The evacuation would require synchronizing helicopters under fire, infantry covering the extraction, and artillery firing until the last possible second. At dawn on July 23rd, the NVA unleashed one of their most violent barrages of the entire siege, attempting to destroy the base before the Americans could escape. The bombardment ignited ammo dumps, ripped through bunkers, and sent debris across the smoldering hilltop. In the chaos, riflemen maneuvered across trenches to reinforce collapsing positions, while medics dragged the wounded toward landing zones. Helicopter crews flew in with unparalleled bravery. Some made multiple trips into the fiery hilltop. UH-1 Hueys hovered just long enough for squads to leap aboard before veering off through tracer fire. Chinooks attempted to extract large equipment, but were driven back by anti-aircraft fire. As units pulled back, artillery batteries continued firing in direct support, even lowering their elevation to hit NVA troops closing in. One by one, the last defenders boarded helicopters and lifted off, watching Ripcord burn below them. Finally, demolition teams destroyed artillery pieces and surviving supplies to prevent their capture. The last American aircraft departed under a storm of mortars, marking the end of the 23-day siege. Though Ripcord was abandoned, the retreat was not a rout. It was a controlled, disciplined extraction under nearly impossible conditions. The NVA occupied the shattered hilltop soon after, but they had paid an enormous price. U.S. intelligence later estimated their casualties exceeded 700 killed and many more wounded. For the Americans, the cost was also heavy. The 101st Airborne suffered 138 killed and over 400 wounded, making Ripcord one of the deadliest battles they faced during the entire war. The Battle of Firebase Ripcord became one of the least publicly known major battles of the Vietnam War, overshadowed by the Kent State shooting and the gradual withdrawal of U.S. forces dominating headlines in 1970. Few Americans at the time even knew that hundreds of soldiers had fought and died on a remote mountain half a world away. The U.S. military also kept details quieter than usual, wary of negative political impact. Only decades later did Ripcord receive the recognition it deserved. Veterans began organizing reunions, and historians uncovered documents revealing how intense and costly the siege truly was. Survivors spoke about the courage of helicopter pilots, the relentless determination of infantry platoons, and the haunting memory of holding a hill that seemed to shrink under constant bombardment. The battle served as a stark example of the shifting nature of the war. Even as political leaders spoke of Vietnamization and troop withdrawals, American soldiers continued facing well-organized, determined opponents capable of mounting sophisticated operations. The legacy of Ripcord also highlighted the professionalism of the 101st Airborne Division, whose soldiers fought with discipline despite overwhelming odds. Many veterans carried physical and emotional scars for life, but they also carried pride, knowing they stood firm in one of the war's harshest trials. Today, Ripcord is remembered not for strategic victory or defeat, but for the endurance, sacrifice, and brotherhood forged in the flames of a hill that symbolized the final era of hard combat in Vietnam. The story of Ripcord remains a testament to those who fought there, a chapter carved not in headlines, but in the memories of the men who survived the siege and the families of those who never came home.